Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good night rest. And welcome to the second day of the conference. So this morning we start with opening remarks by my colleague and my co-host, Professor Michael Hanchard. And to start before he speaks, he will be introduced by Gabriela Melez of Petito, who is Michael's
Good morning, buenos días, buen día, and bonjour, everyone. My name is Gabriela Noles Cotito. I'm a PhD candidate in this department, and it's both an honor and a privilege to introduce our esteemed conference co-host and keynote speaker for today, and my PhD advisor, Professor Michael Hanchard, a distinguished scholar whose work has profoundly shaped our understandings of race, politics, and power in the modern world. Professor Hanchard is the Gustav Hurmerly Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of the Marginalized Populations Program. He is a leading scholar in his fields of specialization, which include comparative political theory, Africana studies, and Latin American politics. His groundbreaking scholarship bridges comparative politics and contemporary political theory, encompassing critical themes such as nationalism, racism, xenophobia, and citizenship. Through his work, Professor Hanchard's research spans Brazil, the US, Latin America, and beyond, providing a comparative and global lens on issues of political representation, citizenship, and social movements. Dr. Hanchard has numerous widely cited and field-defining publications, including Orfeus and Power, the Movimento Negro of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, Brazil, 1945 and 1988, published by Princeton in 1994, a must-read for anyone studying Afro-Brazilian social mobilization. The edition of the volume Racial Politics in Contemporary Brazil, published by Duke in 1999. Party Politics, Horizons in Black Political Thought, published by Oxford in 2006. And a personal favorite, The Spectre of Race, How Discrimination Haunts Western Democracy, published by Princeton in 2018, which received the Ralph Bunche Award from the American Political Science Association in 2019 for the best book on ethnic and cultural pluralism, and was named one of the best 10 books in 2018 by Times Educational Supplement in London. His forthcoming book examines the relationship between fascism and racial rule in contemporary politics. Professor Hanchard has also held visiting professorships at institutions in almost every corner of the world, including the Institute for Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna, the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University, Universidade Cândido Mendes in Rio de Janeiro and Universidade de São Paulo in Brazil, Universidad de Cartagena de Indias in Colombia, the Institute Gramsci in Milan, Italy, the University of Ghana in Legon, and Sciences Po in Paris, France. He has been awarded multiple grants and fellowships, and in 2021, he was elected American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In today's talk, Interrogating Precarity and in the Current Moment, Professor Hanchard will guide us through an urgent conversation on the structures of vulnerability and instability that defines our era. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Hanchard.
Thank you, Gabi, for such a wonderful introduction. My brief commentary is entitled Precarity in the Global South. First, I want to extend greetings to participants and all in attendance here on an early Saturday morning because of Ali. Thanks to Gayatri, Gabriela, and the Africana staff who've given a wonderful effort to bring this conference into being. The word precarity can be deployed to describe a multitude of processes and conditions. A precarious process has, at least to me, a more temporally bound quality, a beginning, middle, and an end. While a condition described as precarious connotes circumstances of longer duration that have seemingly a temporally uncertain ending. Autumn leaves left dangling on tree branches and trunks that once nurtured them as part of the life process, the change of seasons. Nature, however, interacts with nurture, as environmental degradation can speed up or slow down the change from summer to fall and from fall to winter. When precisely will leaves fall? When will fruits be ready for harvest? For most species on the planet, these are all two human causes of ecological, environmental, and social precarity, seemingly separate crises that tumble into one another. Economic deprivation undergirds several modes of precarity, from caloric intake and adequate nutrition to the ability to be adequately housed or receive medical care. A radical, positive change in economic circumstances can make conditions of uncertainty and want temporary rather than permanent. Yet war, famine, imperialism, extractive economies, and policies that unfairly target the marginalized and downtrodden as the source of their own misfortune make it less likely that those who inhabit precarious lives succeed in making an exit from an unstable condition to a more stable one. So much or so little for precarity. What about the global South? Is it a place, an idea, a condition of existence, or all three at once? Some write and speak of the global South in spatial terms, often geopolitical. Jeffrey Sachs, for one, scoffs at the idea of a global South as a contiguous geographic location where poverty and deprivation prevail. The South itself conjures up images of misfortune. South Sudan, the US South, Southern Lebanon, Southern Italy, Southern India, places supposedly that one does not aspire to, but seek an escape from. Or is the global South a political and economic cauldron where alliances and refusals of disparate peoples congeal as a cry, a demand for repair, reparations, and reckoning with history, in short, a site for collective action? Last summer, I spent an afternoon in Jamaica with one of the leading voices for the global South, the Honorable Mia Motley. A core part of, she's Prime Minister of Barbados. A core part of our discussion focused upon her efforts to create and manage partnerships between other nation-state actors on a global stage. For example, the brokering of an agreement with Vicente Maduro, president of Venezuela, that enabled the government of Barbados to utilize tracts of Venezuelan agricultural land to grow foodstuffs for her economy and for her country, since her island in the Eastern Caribbean has little arable land and must up to now import much of its food and pay serious prices for those products on the so-called open market. This relationship, among others of the global South, she explained, was engineered to make Barbados, in concert with other resource-stretched nations on this earth, more autonomous, less reliant on countries like the US or even Ukraine and Russia for wheat and other foodstuffs traded as commodities. I interpreted Prime Minister Motley's description of these kinds of interstate relationships as an effort to promote a countervailing political economy to the dominant capitalist one that exists and that much of the world is forced to kneel before. One can trace a genealogy of Mia Motley's efforts at an alternative political economy to earlier attempts in the 20th century. Proudhon's anarchism, use value economies among the formerly enslaved in the New World, was discussed yesterday. Bandung and the non-aligned movement, the New World Economic Order, the New World Economic Information Order. On the other side, in direct opposition and sequencing, Reaganism, Thatcherism, and OPEC. And yet there is an epistemic elephant in the parlor room of discussions about the global South. If precarity is not a place, but a condition, then how do we make sense of the fact that the global South has no monopoly on the precarity of the Anthropocene, its effects on the entire globe and all who inhabit it? Robin Kelly, that's why I circulated that journal, that just came out last week, in a marvelous recent essay, cautions us against focusing on, quote, inequality between nations to the exclusion of inequality within nations. Instead, Professor Kelly urges us to acknowledge that the two are, quote, inextricably linked. I'm quoting here again at length. While wealth extracted from the colonies certainly benefited the metropoles, or what we call the global north, not all classes within the metropoles share the fruits of colonial exploitation equally. Surplus derived from colonies partly fueled industrial growth and deepened the exploitation of metropolitan workers. Thus, there are connections to be drawn, for example, between the children who literally ingest cognitive impairment through the consumption of lead paint in Baltimore. Think about it, Freddie Gray. The children who suffer disproportionately from asthma and respiratory-related illnesses in Appalachia and the Cumberland Gap. And those children and adults who risk their lives and well-being mining for precious metals and electronic equipment discarded by overdeveloped nations in exchange for cash just outside of Accra, Ghana. At this junction, the global South and global North meet within that dystopic ecosystem of producers, consumers, and scavengers. It is my hope that my co-convener of this project, Africana Studies Center Director Wale Alibani, engage conference participants to explore commonalities and differences across cases, to show how, when, and where, for example, the homeless army of Seattle, the unhoused children of Rio de Janeiro who sleep just beneath the asphalt of the city sidewalks during cold months in an effort to stay warm, the squatters of Delhi, Kingston, Panama, and the Philippines, and elsewhere, who experience the phenomenology of deprivation in a world filled with too much stuff. Among these disparate locales are a family of resemblances that only those who fetishize profit and social order at the expense of sustainability, morality, and ethics can ignore. We live in grave times indeed, in two senses of the word, both in terms of the severity of the crises we face and in terms of the looming clarity before us of our own collective demise. Enjoy.
Thank you very much for that excellent reflection. We'll have some time to, if you don't mind, to perhaps reflect on this. I am struck by the reference you made to the argument about inequality within nations.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you reflect about the relationship between precarity and instability. If we assume that precarity is a necessary condition of instability, are we then implying that stable systems, reduce precarity? And if so, what are the dynamics that limit that kind of orientation when you relate that to your argument? I mean, the argument you presented about inequality within nations, and you gave fantastic examples of that, where certain populations within the biggest economy in the world will share the same kind of precarity with people in perhaps the poorest part of the nation, of the world. So I'm wondering, therefore, should we assume that precarity, even though precarity is a necessary condition of inequality or stable systems, does it mean that stable systems, do they necessarily limit precarity, or do they limit precarity only for certain parts of the population?
Yeah. No, this is a good question. So I think I would make the distinction between stability and order.
Okay.
So that if you think about, for example, the desire or the need for the overdeveloped countries and their regimes to manage certain populations, it's going to manage them in terms of labor, but also keep down the prospects of protest. Right. And we find that particularly in this moment between Gaza and a range of other different crises that the world is currently facing, we're plunging headway into kind of an abyss. So that's where the distinction I would make between a social order or status quo and the question of stability.
Okay. So what would be the differences you would then draw in terms of, say, economic stability, political stability, social stability in relation to political order, social order, economic order? Because I'm asking because while, of course, the most important project of the state anywhere is to keep order,
Yes,
and it's not primarily to ensure
equality,
equality or good governance or good life. is primarily to keep order. And because the idea is that order is the condition for every other thing and not justice. That's oftentimes the attitude of those who run the state. The justice is never their first condition, order is their first condition. So what does that mean in your take for stability in relation to the instabilities that most people face, whether within those conditions of order or even in states that are facing conditions of disorder, like South Sudan, like Somalia and the rest?
Well, so I think if I understand your question, that these things can often operate simultaneously.
Okay.
So if I were to give more examples, for example, I can think about in my own youth growing up in New York, many friends of mine who have died, Black men and some women from sarcoidosis, because they were hired with lower wages, without health benefits, to tear out asbestos out of walls, or people who went to work and at the 9/11 site with no health insurance, but because they were patriots, and then coming down with these mysterious diseases and dying, 2 or 3 years later, right? So that can happen on the most overdeveloped country on the planet, right? You can have both this question of instability and precarity, with at the same time the conditions for everyone really to have health insurance, for everyone really to have a living wage. And these things have not congealed into a significant crisis in the US yet, but it may be coming.
Yeah, but one final thing before it's always struck me that one of the basic differences between the social democracy that developed in Western Western Europe after the Second World War was to link the generalized, good life to order, to social order. And that seems to be a question that the United States really has never resolved. While we have, a part of the political system that sees a link between social welfare, generalized, welfare as, condition for social order, we have the people on the right particularly who see social order as not being conditional on most people having good life, that in fact, social order is conditioned on the capacity for violence and not so much the capacity to be able to generalize welfare, such that less and less people within the population will be prone to violence or will embrace violence.
Yeah. So I think the relative and absolute terms. So we think about in economic terms that capitalism has always allowed for a certain degree of underemployment or unemployment, right? And so most of the economic measures of employment often, particularly in liberal economics, don't really account for the people who've given up looking for jobs, who work 5 or 10 hours a week instead of 50 or 60 hours a week, which they would like, right? On the other hand, the idea that been further and further eroded, at least in the US, is the idea of a social contract. So for me, at least, that distinction between a certain kind of liberalism and the inability for many to link liberalism as a political economy from liberalism as a philosophy, right? So I think in some sense, this is kind of where the rubber is meeting the road right now.
And you think that seems to the society might unravel soon on the basis of this?
Well, I think part of it is that the United States, in many ways, I'm generalizing here, but I think the majority of people who voted for Donald Trump, they got the president that they wanted, right? So we have to, beg the question: if those people are satisfied with the current order or the chaos, what happens to those who are not, right? And what will happen to, say, for example, all the federal employees who, 2 or 3 months from now are behind on their mortgages? Will that lead to a certain kind of social revolt? I mean, the literature in the 70s and 80s will talk about not blue collar strikes, but sort of gray collar strikes, right? Certain sectors of what they used to call labor aristocracy, but really now more of a bureaucratic or technocratic class, right? So those sort of things in Marxist terms, what you call we're in a conjunctural moment where a lot of things are up for grabs. but I think it's going to take a lot of collective action and agency to bring these different crises to the fore with greater clarity and urgency.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Is there a question? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I was thinking yesterday and thinking now, one of the things I wish we said yesterday that was, yesterday was the observation of the assassination of Dr. King.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wonder that in these discussions about precarity and these other terms that we're using, even though Dr. King didn't use those kind of terms, if we look at his later work and what he was trying to do, does he fit within this frame that you're talking about in terms of addressing these particular issues? Would he be a good place to start? Because I don't see people talking about him in this context, in these discussions. And, his last planned sermon was why America may go to hell.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Based on
Yeah.
America having the resources
Yeah.
and things to
Yeah.
eradicate many of these issues. And the other one is from an academic perspective. How valuable do you think going back and reflecting on world systems theory is for these kind of discussions?
Yeah, no, it's that the second one's a big question. I mean, certainly Samir Amin, Wallerstein, a whole host of people I can think of. Walter Rodney off the top of my head. Done incredible work. But at the same time, at least the earlier generation, there was a certain static quality to some of this sort of discussion of the dynamics of development and underdevelopment. But certainly by the end of his life, King made a very fateful turn. One where he stopped. I mean, he made a critique of the U.S. domestic policy, but then made a shift to also critique U.S. foreign policy. But that was also preceded by people. I mean, people don't like to give them credit. The Nation of Islam, which was part of the reason why Muhammad Ali said, "I don't have any power with the Viet Cong." Right? I mean, in very simple terms, basically making an anti-imperialist comment. So that strand we found in Black political thought and Black collective action, right? Before King.
So I think I wanted to just understand for you, like, how it's changing in this current movement about the precarity. I think and what you see in terms of how it will change, because framing of capital, I mean, capitalism is kind of moving in a different direction in the US, becoming more capitalist. There's that impulse again.
Yeah,
Neoliberalism is sort of gone by the wayside, in the sense that not tied to globalization in the same way which we understood the neoliberal project. So I'm just, I guess I would just want to know your thoughts in terms of how capitalist accumulation, the transformations, if you do see it, and if it is like more capitalist in the way in which at least Trumpians are talking about it, that is going to sort of evolve, and like what kinds of precarity would we be seeing, or what should we be bracing ourselves for?
Well, actually, Kavan and I were talking a little bit about this last night. My own way of thinking, Trump, I think two things. He doesn't really understand the nature of capitalism and the integration of global markets that in many ways teases out the boundaries between the national and the global. So the idea that tariffs would only affect the production companies and won't affect workers in the United States, either at the point of production or the point of consumption, means that he kind of fundamentally misunderstands how capitalism works. I would characterize his policy as neo-mercantilist right now, rather than mercantilist, but it's based on this kind of outdated ideas of competitive advantage, combined with a kind of oligarchic and kleptocratic sensibility.
Okay. Yes. Well, one of the world historical events which the kind of writers of the 70s really didn't foresee was the rise of East Asia and the transformation of the world economy, and in many which is one of the things that has provoked the U.S. response. And I'd like to get your thoughts on the fact that this is really the first time that a part of the world economy that has no genealogical ties to European civilization, however defined, is at least perceived as a major threat by not just the United States, in these senses, but in many countries.
There was a communist today on Chinese neocolonialism, which is one response from other parts of
Yes,
of the poor parts of it, but it's not the only response. So in many ways, the decline in global inequality has largely been driven, although not only by capitalist development in East Asia. Ironically, now if China keeps growing, it'll actually add to global inequality because it's past the middle threshold.
right,
While at the same time within countries, there's been a rising inequality. In fact, the economist Branko Milanovic said this was
yes,
from
yes.
Marx to Fanon
Yes.
and back to Marx,
Yes,
because
yes.
class inequality is outstretching in some ways, not all, in between country inequality. So, you know, this is a world historical change compared
Yes,
to the last
yes.
200, 300 years of history. So, you know, how much do we need to rethink? You know, we all use these concepts that we've been reading for 30, 40
Yes,
years now.
exactly.
How much do we need to rethink the fact that it's a whole part of the world which in relation with the rest of it has transformed the world economy, causing both opportunity and threat.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. One of the things that, at least in parts of the world I know reasonably well, one of the discussions I was involved in during my time in Jamaica last summer was with some of the scholars, political actors, kind of stalwarts of the Workers' Party of Jamaica and the like, but also the sort of everyday person who, in referencing the Chinese who have come and they've built roads and bridges, they said, well, at least they provided infrastructure, which the British didn't provide. You hear that in Ghana, you hear that in a range of different places. So if they're an imperialist actor, it's a different kind of imperialism. For me, I think, you know, the squashing and the repression of human agency and dignity is something that makes me very fearful for China's descendants in certain kinds of ways. But then we get back to a kind of old question about, well, how do you balance, you know, by what criteria or does one assess economic growth and economic success at the expense of political egalitarianism? I think my former advisor, Emilia Vialti da Costa, used to make the distinction between conservative liberalism and liberalism. And she's saying that many of the Latin American elites at the end of slavery, they wanted conservatism. So in other words, they wanted all the economic benefits of liberalism, but without the political chances one has to risk. If one really believed in the idea that each person was an individual system, possessed individualism with a set of rights, and they could exercise that right, then what would that mean for a certain kind of stability or order?
Oh, one more. Okay, last one.
Okay, thank you. I have to apologize for missing the talk, but just in terms of the conversation, I think I was struck at the time when Wale asked this question of how it is that in the West, since we just talked about Europe now, how is it that in Europe we had after the Second World War, we kind of had the rise of the welfare state as a kind of effort or project that was central to making order, whereas in the United States we did not have that. And I wanted to push your thoughts a little bit on this question with regards to the idea of race as a very central principle to how it is that in the European context we had a different story, and here in America perhaps had a different story. Because in Europe we are beginning to see many people question this welfare state as the societies are becoming much more multiracial.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And it seems to me that that in the context of the United States, that fear of extending care to the racial order was central to why many people were hesitant, because after the end of slavery, many people didn't want to have the burden of care over the formerly enslaved. First, they promised, land and whatever, they didn't deliver it. And then the slaves, what eventually happened is that they were just roaming about. And of course, you could then gather them up, round them up and throw them in jail as vagabonds and stuff like that. because it was easier and it was then also a source of labor in the end for free labor or cheap labor. So I wonder how race figures in these kinds of equations, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
And I quickly add that, Michael, you must reference your work in response to that, because I think this is so central to the work you're doing about how race has been at the center of all of these imaginations.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So first part of the question, I think in terms of the kind of US timeline, it's important to remember the New Deal, which predates, the sort of post-World War II sensibility. And ever since really Reconstruction, the right in whatever form, whether Democratic or Republican, has tried to tear away at that fabric of the idea of a mutual set of responsibilities binding the citizen to the state. My last book, The Spectre of Race, deals explicitly with this question, that this in many ways has to do with the limitations of democratic form. That democracies have since classical Athens relied on some form of difference to promote inequality, right? So Arendt has this great line where she talks of the possibilities of politics, where she writes about it was impossible for the citizen of the Greek polis to be both a citizen and a slave. One could not be both. So one of the central questions in most liberal democracies is who's going to work and who's not going to work. Who's going to work for a livable wage and who won't be able to work for a livable wage. And these questions are highly racialized. They've always been.
Thank you very much. I think this has been very incisive and interesting. And I want to thank Michael again for the talk, and to thank you all for the question.
Thank all of you for the question.
So we will translate, smoothly to the next, the first panel of the day.